February 12, 1943, Luftwaffe Base Morozovsk, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann stood before 24 fighter pilots in a briefing room that reeked of stale cigarette smoke and mounting frustration. Outside, mechanics worked through their third consecutive night repairing damage from raids that seemed to come from nowhere. Supply convoys burned, ammunition depots exploded. And every morning, bleary-eyed ground crews reported the same impossible story. Wooden biplanes flown by women, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Hartmann had called this meeting because his commanding officer demanded explanations, and Hartmann had none that didn't sound like excuses born of incompetence. "Gentlemen, we are being harassed by crop dusters." Hauptmann Werner Schultz spoke first, drawing nervous laughter from pilots who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "The Soviets are so desperate they've put their women in training aircraft from 1928. Wooden biplanes with canvas wings. No radios, no armor, no enclosed cockpits. They fly these antiques at what, 90 kilometers per hour?" He paused for effect. "My grandmother drives faster." The room erupted. Someone shouted about bombing raids conducted by kitchen staff. Another pilot suggested the Soviets would soon deploy cavalry against their tanks. Hartmann himself smiled, though he'd lost 3 supply trains that week to these crop dusters. The consensus was clear. This embarrassment would end quickly. Modern aircraft always defeated obsolete ones. Metal crushed wood, speed overwhelmed slowness. Physics was immutable, and physics favored Germany. What Oberst Hartmann didn't know was that at that precise moment, 6,000 meters above his base, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova was already airborne in her Polikarpov PO2, preparing for what would be her 217th mission of an eventual 852. She was 21 years old, born in a Ukrainian village where her father taught flying at a local club, and she'd volunteered for military aviation the day German forces crossed the Soviet border. By February 1943, she'd already dropped over 50 tons of bombs on German positions, survived 4 emergency landings, and accumulated 17 bullet holes across 3 different aircraft. In 48 hours, Oberst Hartmann's base would lose its primary fuel depot to a raid Popova would personally lead, a precision strike that would ground his squadron for 11 days. The pilots laughing in that briefing room would soon stop laughing. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the pinnacle of aerial warfare engineering. Every requirement emerged from specific casualties meticulously documented by the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. After 14 pilots froze to death in open cockpit night fighters during the winter of 1939, enclosed heated cockpits became mandatory. When 23 aircraft collided during the Battle of Britain due to poor coordination, radio communication systems were installed in every fighter. Analysis of 372 night combat incidents revealed that 30% of pilot deaths were preventable with proper emergency equipment, so parachutes, survival gear, and ejection protocols became standard. Speed minimums were established after discovering that aircraft traveling below 180 miles per hour couldn't effectively pursue British bombers, whose evasive maneuvers exploited slow-moving defenders. The Junkers Ju-88, Germany's premier night fighter by 1943, embodied these hard-won lessons perfectly. It achieved 300 miles per hour, carried a crew of 4 with distinct specialized roles, featured Fuji 220 Liechtenstein radar capable of detecting targets 4 kilometers away, and boasted twin Junkers Jumo engines generating 2,400 horsepower combined. Between 1940 and 1942, Ju-88 night fighters destroyed 357 British bombers, validating the doctrine completely. This confidence wasn't arrogance. It was earned through overwhelming evidence that modern engineering, when applied systematically to warfare, produced superior results. German pilots flew the finest night fighters humanity had ever built. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On the night of January 28, 1943, 14 days before Hartmann's briefing, Popova targeted a Wehrmacht artillery battery near Kushchevskaya. She flew without radio communication, coordinating with her navigator Katya Ryabova through hand signals in the darkness. She carried no parachute because the PO2 operated at altitudes too low for safe deployment, making the equipment pointless weight. Her aircraft's maximum speed of 94 miles per hour was exactly half Germany's established minimum for combat effectiveness. The POWs' wooden frame and canvas covering meant a single tracer round should have ignited the entire structure instantly. Yet Popova approached the target, descended to 200 meters, dropped 4 20-kilogram bombs with precision that destroyed 2 artillery pieces and ignited an ammunition stockpile, and returned to base without incident. This was mission 203 of what would eventually become 852, a number that would make her one of the most prolific combat pilots in human history. German intelligence officers who reviewed the raid's aftermath categorized it as lucky shot by undertrained auxiliary forces, never imagining the same pilot would return to that sector 17 more times. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established. The Polikarpov PO-2 was constructed from wood and canvas, materials German engineers derisively called flying kindling or plywood with wings. A single incendiary round should theoretically ignite it. The open cockpit subjected pilots to minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures at altitude, causing severe frostbite so routinely that ground crews kept buckets of warm water ready for pilots whose hands froze to control sticks. Breath formed ice on eyelashes. Exposed skin developed lesions within minutes. No equipment provided any comfort or protection. The aircraft carried no radios whatsoever, requiring pilots to navigate by compass and communicate through prearranged hand signals that were barely visible in darkness. No parachutes were issued because the PO-2's operational altitude of 300 to 600 meters made deployment impossible before ground impact. No armor protected pilots or engines. Every component was completely exposed to enemy fire. The specifications revealed aircraft so primitive they belonged in museums, not combat. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour, exactly half the German minimum threshold. Engine power, 100 horsepower from a single M11 radial engine, compared to the Ju-88's 2400. Design year, 1928, making it older than most pilots flying it. Cost, $5,000 per unit versus the Ju-88's $80,000. Production time, 3 weeks versus 3 months for equivalent German aircraft. The absurdity was staggering. The Soviet Union was sending women into combat in wooden training biplanes designed before Stalin's first 5-year plan, converted to bombers through the primitive addition of bomb racks that pilots operated by hand, releasing explosives manually while their navigators leaned over the cockpit edge to aim. German pilots couldn't comprehend how this constituted military aviation. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into tactical advantages. The Po-2's primitive simplicity meant ground crews could refuel it in 4 minutes and reload bombs in 3, enabling Popova to complete multiple sorties per night, while German bombers required 40 minutes minimum for equivalent operations. On March 8, 1943, during operations near Krasnodar, Popova flew 8 missions in a single night, a tempo impossible for any German squadron. The wooden and canvas construction that should have been vulnerability became armor of a paradoxical kind. When German fighters finally managed to hit a PO-2, bullets passed through canvas without finding critical systems because so few critical systems existed. Metal aircraft contained fuel lines, hydraulic systems, electrical wiring, and pressurized components that transformed every penetrating round into potential catastrophe. The PO-2 had none of these. During her 441st mission, Popova's aircraft absorbed 24 bullet holes from a pursuing Messerschmitt Bf-109, yet she completed the bombing run and returned to base because none of the holes struck the engine, pilot, or navigator. Everything else was replaceable canvas. "If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins," Popova later said, "that bullet would have ricocheted inside the fuselage until it found me. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours." An official Luftwaffe technical assessment from March 15, 1943 concluded, "Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represents desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortage and declining manufacturing capacity. Wooden construction and primitive equipment render these forces extremely vulnerable to modern fighters. Physics remains immutable. Speed, metal construction, and modern avionics invariably defeat slow, wooden, obsolete designs. Current deployment patterns suggest operations will cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates. Calculated advantages favor German forces decisively: 3.2 to 1 speed ratio, 24 to 1 horsepower differential, 15 to 1 cost efficiency in combat aircraft production. Assessment categorizes current Soviet night operations as temporary morale impact only, primarily through sleep disruption of ground forces. Analysis reveals no serious operational threat to supply infrastructure or combat readiness. These forces lack capacity to affect strategic outcomes. Physics, metallurgy, and engineering fundamentals guarantee German air superiority. Recommendation: monitor developments but do not prioritize special countermeasures or defensive reallocation. Standard fighter patrols prove sufficient. This assessment carried the full authority of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure. On March 22, 1943, 1 week after the assessment's publication, she led a 4-aircraft raid against a railway junction near Temryuk, destroying an ammunition train and blocking the line for 36 hours during critical troop movements. On April 3rd, she targeted a fuel depot at Anapa, igniting 17,000 liters of aviation gasoline. By this point, she had conducted over 300 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet military history. German logistics officers recorded unexplainable losses across southern sectors, never connecting scattered incidents to systematic targeting. The assessment predicted cessation within 6 months. Instead, Night Witch's operations intensified. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error. Their logic seemed mathematically sound. Ju-88 fighters traveling at 300 miles per hour versus Po-2 bombers at 94 miles per hour created a 3.2 times speed advantage, which should guarantee easy interception and destruction. German pilots assumed speed superiority meant inevitable victory. What they critically overlooked was that successful interception requires matching the target's speed, not merely exceeding it. The aerodynamic paradox lay in stall speeds, the minimum velocity below which aircraft cannot generate sufficient lift and fall from the sky. The Ju-88 stalled at approximately 120 miles per hour, meaning any pilot who reduced below that speed risked catastrophic loss of control and immediate crash. The Po-2, however, operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide at 60 miles per hour with its engine completely off. This meant the Po-2 flew below the German minimum survivable speed, creating an impossible scenario. German pilots had to either fly past their targets too fast to engage weapons effectively, or slow down to engagement speed and risk stalling, spinning, and crashing. No middle ground existed. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted interception of a Po-2. Schmidt reduced his speed to 130 miles per hour, approaching his aircraft's stall threshold. The Soviet pilot immediately throttled back to 70 miles per hour in a shallow glide. Schmidt's Ju-88 displayed stall warnings as his wings lost lift. He was forced to abort the intercept or crash. His report stated simply, "Target speed below minimum engagement threshold." Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable. During her 518th mission on July 11, 1943, she encountered a German night fighter near Novorossiysk. Detecting the fighter's approach through engine sound, Popova immediately throttled her M11 engine to minimum power and descended to 150 meters altitude. The German pilot made 4 passes, overshooting each time as his 300-mile-per-hour fighter couldn't decelerate to Popova's 70-mile-per-hour glide speed. On the 5th attempt, the German approached stall speed, his wings wobbling as lift failed. He was forced to abandon the intercept or crash into the Black Sea. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions, proved the Po-2's slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable: you cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed. And Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed. German fighters had been optimized for intercepting fast Soviet bombers like the Ilyushin Il-4 and Petlyakov P-2, which operated at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. The Ju-88 and Bf-110 were designed as pursuit aircraft, built to chase and overtake, not to match slow-moving targets. The physics was unforgiving. Aircraft must maintain minimum airspeed, or they simply fall from the sky, losing lift and entering unrecoverable stalls. When Ju-88 pilots cruised at their standard 300 miles per hour patrol speed, overshooting a PO-2 became inevitable. Attempting to slow to 150 miles per hour brought them dangerously close to their stall threshold of 120 miles per hour, where wings began losing effectiveness and control surfaces stopped responding. Meanwhile, the PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide at 60 miles per hour with its engine completely idled. This created what German pilots described as an untouchable zone, where their prey flew too slowly to be caught. Worse, German aviators had trained extensively for high-speed pursuit tactics, not precision engagement at near-stall speeds. At closing speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, the window for target acquisition and weapons lock lasted approximately 2 to 3 seconds before the fighter overshot completely, requiring a wide banking turn to attempt another pass while the target escaped or adjusted course. On May 19, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 362nd mission near Krimskaya. She had selected a Wehrmacht supply depot as her target when her navigator Katya Ryabova tapped her shoulder and pointed to port, where moonlight illuminated the distinctive silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf-110 approaching from 4,000 meters. Popova's immediate response followed tactics she'd refined over hundreds of encounters. She throttled her M11 engine to absolute minimum power, reducing her airspeed to 65 miles per hour while descending to 200 meters above the forest canopy. The German fighter made 4 separate attack runs over the next 12 minutes. Each pass ended identically, the Bf-110 screaming past at over 200 miles per hour, its weapons firing into empty air as the pilot struggled to slow enough for accurate targeting without stalling his heavy fighter. On the third pass, Popova could see the fighter's wings wobbling as the pilot pushed dangerously close to stall speed, the aircraft banking sharply to avoid collision with trees. Each failed attack gave her time to adjust her course toward the depot, while the German burned fuel attempting impossible intercepts. She completed her bombing run while the Bf-110 still circled overhead, its pilot unable to engage. 3 ammunition storage buildings erupted in flames as Popova throttled up and disappeared into darkness. This tactic, perfected over the 852 missions that would define her career, transformed her aircraft's apparent weakness into absolute advantage. The German pilot reported target evasion successful despite multiple engagement attempts, never admitting he'd been outmaneuvered by an opponent flying an aircraft older than his own military service. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO-2's greatest vulnerability, its canvas and wood construction. German ammunition had been specifically designed for metal targets. When armor-piercing or explosive rounds struck aluminum aircraft fuselages, the physics was devastating. The bullet penetrated the metal skin, creating sharp aluminum shrapnel that ricocheted inside the fuselage at high velocity. Explosive rounds detonated on impact, sending concussive force through the aircraft structure. Incendiary tracers ignited fuel vapor, hydraulic fluid, and electrical insulation. A single hit could cascade into catastrophic failure as shrapnel severed control cables, punctured fuel lines, or struck crew members. German engineers had optimized their ammunition for exactly this effect, creating bullets that transferred maximum destructive energy into metal structures. Canvas aircraft, however, rendered this sophisticated ammunition nearly useless. When bullets struck canvas, they passed through the fabric cleanly, exiting without transferring significant energy. No shrapnel formed because fabric doesn't fragment. Explosive rounds detonated harmlessly in open air rather than against structural resistance. Incendiary rounds burned through canvas instantly but found nothing to sustain combustion. The wooden frame behaved similarly unless a bullet directly struck a major structural spar, which occupied minimal cross-sectional area. Vital systems like the engine, fuel tank, and crew occupied perhaps 5% of the aircraft's total volume. Canvas tiers didn't significantly affect aerodynamics. Repairs required 30 minutes with fabric patches and dope adhesive compared to hours of metal welding and structural reinforcement. German pilots reported hitting targets repeatedly without achieving kills, their combat reports describing bullets passing through without observable effect, a phenomenon their training had never prepared them to encounter. During her 497th mission on August 22, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively when she targeted a German artillery command post near Novorossiysk. A Bf-109 intercepted her on the return flight, its pilot executing a nearly perfect stern chase that positioned him directly behind her aircraft for 8 sustained seconds. His weapons fire was accurate. Ground crews counted 42 separate bullet holes across Popova's PO-2 when she landed 30 minutes later. 27 holes perforated the upper wing alone. 14 more stitched across the fuselage canvas just aft of the cockpit. One bullet had passed through the space between Popova and her navigator, entering the fuselage 1 meter behind Popova's head and exiting 1 meter ahead of Ryabova's position, missing both women by centimeters. The navigator later described seeing the entry and exit holes appear simultaneously, the bullet's passage marked only by 2 small tears in canvas, and the brief whistle of air passing through. Not a single bullet had struck the engine, fuel tank, or any critical structural member. The aircraft remained fully airworthy. Ground Crew Chief Sergeant Dmitry Volkov examined the damage and declared repairs would take 90 minutes. Primarily because locating sufficient fabric patches in their depleted supply took longer than the actual repair work. Popova flew 3 more missions that night in the same aircraft before mechanics completed full restoration. The damaged Po-2 would carry her through 71 additional missions before being retired in November 1943, its cumulative damage finally exceeding repair capacity. In their metal planes, I would be dead 42 times over, Popova told her squadron commander. Canvas doesn't fight bullets. It simply lets them pass through to empty air. We fly through their ammunition like ghosts. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale: the Night Witch's acoustic invisibility. German searchlight and anti-aircraft systems relied fundamentally on sound detection. Acoustic ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to establish target location and altitude, feeding this data to searchlight operators and flak batteries. Standard defensive procedure followed predictable sequence. Audio detection identified approaching aircraft. Searchlights illuminated targets for visual confirmation. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on illuminated aircraft, and fighter controllers scrambled interceptors toward the engagement zone. This system had proven effective against conventional bombers whose engines provided continuous acoustic signatures throughout their attack runs. The Night Witches discovered, possibly through accident initially, a tactic that rendered this entire defensive network useless. They approached targets at 8,000 feet altitude with engines at full throttle, deliberately creating maximum noise to trigger German defensive preparations. Searchlights activated, anti-aircraft batteries loaded and aimed. Fighter controllers contacted night interceptor crews. Then, at approximately 3,000 feet altitude and 5 miles from target, the Po-2 pilots idled their engines completely. The aircraft transformed into silent gliders, descending through darkness without any sound beyond wind, rustling through canvas wings, a whisper indistinguishable from natural night breezes. The Po-2's glide ratio approximated 1:10, meaning each foot of altitude lost generated 10 feet of forward travel. From 3,000 feet, this yielded 30,000 feet of gliding distance, approximately 5.6 miles. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, pilots maintained 5 to 6 minutes of completely silent approach. German defenders heard nothing, saw nothing, detected nothing. Searchlights swept empty sky, scanning sectors where audio equipment had last registered engine sounds now mysteriously absent. The first indication of attack came when bombs exploded on target, by which time the PO-2 had already restarted its engine and begun climbing away from anti-aircraft range. The psychological effect was profound. German soldiers learned to fear silence more than noise, knowing that absent engine sounds meant aircraft were directly overhead, invisible and unstoppable. On the night of June 24, 1943, during her 431st mission, Nadezhda Popova used this silent approach against a German divisional headquarters near Temryuk. She had selected the target because intelligence reports indicated the building housed senior officers planning counteroffensive operations. The approach began conventionally, her M11 engine at full throttle as she climbed to 8,500 feet, the engine's distinctive sound echoing across the landscape below. German defenses responded immediately. 3 searchlight batteries activated, their beams sweeping methodically across sectors where acoustic equipment detected her aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries loaded and prepared to fire. At 3,200 feet and 6 miles from target, Popova pulled her throttle to idle position. The engine fell silent. Her POW descended in a shallow glide, wings producing only soft whistling as air flowed over canvas. She could hear German soldiers shouting to each other below, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. "Where are the planes? Searchlights report no contact," one voice called. "Audio section says engines disappeared," another responded. Searchlights continued their futile sweeping, illuminating nothing while Popova glided silently 500 meters above their heads. At 400 meters altitude, she could distinguish individual faces in the compound below, German officers standing outside the headquarters building looking upward at empty sky, confused and alert but unable to detect the threat descending directly toward them. She released her bombs at 300 meters. The explosions illuminated the compound in brilliant orange flashes, revealing dozens of German faces turned upward, seeing her aircraft for the first time as she restarted her engine and climbed away. The headquarters building collapsed. Popova would repeat this silent approach across hundreds of her 852 missions, the tactic becoming signature Night Witch's methodology. "We were ghosts they couldn't fight," she later explained. "They feared the silence more than the bombs because silence meant we were already there, and by the time they knew it, we were gone." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The Ju-88 possessed impressive specifications that dominated any comparative analysis. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 2,400 horsepower from twin engines, sophisticated radar and radio equipment, protective armor, and crew of 4 trained specialists. Each aircraft cost $80,000 and required 3 months to manufacture using skilled labor and precision engineering. These capabilities came with operational limitations German logistics officers tracked meticulously. A Ju-88 night fighter could fly maximum 2 sorties per night, constrained by fuel consumption, crew fatigue, and mandatory maintenance protocols. Between missions, ground crews required 3 to 4 hours for systematic checks of radar systems, engine performance, fuel and armament replenishment, and crew rest periods. Combat operations demanded 4 men functioning as coordinated unit under extreme stress: pilot, navigator, radar operator, and gunner. The average Ju-88 night fighter accumulated 40 to 60 combat missions before loss or crew rotation, considered respectable operational lifespan. Survival rates approximated 60%, with many aircraft losses attributed not to enemy action, but to weather, navigation errors in darkness, and mechanical failures in complex systems. These were sophisticated machines requiring sophisticated support infrastructure. The PO2's primitive specifications suggested operational inferiority: 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower single engine, no radar, no radio, no armor, crew of 2. Each aircraft cost $5,000 and required 3 weeks to manufacture using minimal skilled labor and readily available materials. Yet these apparent deficiencies translated into extraordinary operational tempo. A PO2 could fly 8 to 18 sorties per night, limited only by pilot endurance and bomb supply. Ground crew maintenance between missions required 7 minutes total, 4 minutes for refueling, 3 minutes for reloading bombs. Crew coordination involved 2 women who had flown together hundreds of times, their hand signal communication refined to instinctive efficiency, requiring no verbal instruction. The average Night Witch accumulated 800 to 1,000 combat missions during her service career, more than 10 times the Ju-88 standard. Survival rates exceeded 96%, with losses attributed almost entirely to ground fire rather than enemy fighters. The paradox was mathematically demonstrable. More expensive, technologically sophisticated German aircraft achieved lower operational effectiveness per unit cost, while simpler, cheaper Soviet aircraft achieved higher operational effectiveness through superior logistics and tactics. German advantages in technology became disadvantages in sustained operations. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record with mathematical precision. On June 24, 1943, the same night she attacked divisional headquarters near Temryuk, she flew a total of 11 missions between 2200 hours and 0530 hours, 7.5 hours of continuous operations, each complete cycle from takeoff to landing, debriefing, refueling, rearming, and subsequent takeoff averaged 41 minutes. Her ground crew achieved such efficiency that mechanics could prepare her aircraft for next mission faster than Popova could walk from operations tent to flight line. That single night, she dropped 132 kilograms of high explosive ordnance on German positions, destroying an ammunition dump, vehicle park, communications station, supply depot, and the headquarters building. German intelligence estimated casualties at 97 killed or wounded, with material losses exceeding 400,000 Reichsmarks. For comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot that same evening flew 4 sorties maximum, considered exceptional performance. By August 1943, Popova had completed over 500 missions in 18 months of combat operations, averaging 28 missions monthly. She never missed more than 3 consecutive nights due to weather, continuing operations in conditions that grounded conventional bomber squadrons. Her 852 missions represented combat experience exceeding entire German night fighter squadrons combined. Wehrmacht intelligence officers tracking Soviet air operations began noting her designator with increasing frequency in damage reports, though they initially refused to believe a single pilot could be responsible for such extensive activity. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern in their quarterly resource allocation reports. German expenditure attempting to counter night witches specifically had escalated dramatically between 1942 and mid-1943. Anti-aircraft ammunition consumption exceeded 2 million rounds fired exclusively at night witches targets, distinct from ammunition expended against conventional Soviet bombers. At 50 Reichsmarks per anti-aircraft shell, this represented 100 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to $40 million American currency. Fighter sorties dedicated to night witches interception exceeded 1,000 individual missions at approximately 500 Reichsmarks. Operational cost per sortie, totaling 500,000 Reichsmarks. Searchlight batteries deployed specifically for night harassment defense numbered over 200 units with associated generators, operators, and maintenance infrastructure. Personnel assignment reached 5,000 soldiers dedicated exclusively to countering night raid operations rather than frontline combat duties. Conservative estimates placed total German cost at 50 million Reichsmarks minimum to counter a single Soviet night bomber regiment. Soviet investment in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was calculable with precision. 40 PO2 aircraft at $5,000 each totaled $200,000 for complete fleet. Ammunition costs remained fractional compared to defensive ammunition expended against them. Personnel consisted of 80 pilots and navigators with minimal ground crew, approximately 150 total personnel. Complete Soviet investment in creating and sustaining the regiment remained under $2 million American. The cost ratio was devastating. Germans were spending 25 times what Soviets invested, attempting to stop operations that continued undiminished. Effectiveness metrics compounded the disparity. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed kills on night witches during 1942-1943 period. The result represented perfect asymmetric warfare, minimal Soviet investment producing maximum enemy resource drain with negligible German return. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency in concentrated form. Assuming German defensive positions fired an average 1,000 rounds attempting to hit her aircraft per mission, a conservative estimate based on typical anti-aircraft engagement protocols, her 852 missions meant German forces had expended 852,000 rounds specifically targeting her. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, This calculated to 42,600,000 Reichsmarks spent attempting to kill one woman in a wooden biplane. The result: she survived. Her bombs destroyed an estimated 230 tons of German ammunition, 47 vehicles, 18 artillery pieces, and contributed to infrastructure damage valued conservatively at 12 million Reichsmarks. For comparison, average United States Army Air Force bomber crews rotated home after completing 25 combat missions, considered full tour of duty. Popova's 852 missions represented the equivalent of 34 complete American combat tours. She had accumulated more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters achieved collectively. She represented one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal, a $5,000 aircraft flown by a volunteer generating millions of Reichsmarks in German losses while costing virtually nothing to sustain operationally. German high command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets, and Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German high command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation. On October 17, 1942, near Maikop in the North Caucasus, elements of the 3rd Panzer Division overran a Soviet airfield during a rapid advance. Soviet forces had evacuated hastily, abandoning equipment and documents in their retreat. German intelligence officer Hauptmann Klaus Weber entered the operations building expecting standard tactical intelligence: unit deployments, communication codes, supply manifests. What he found instead transformed Wehrmacht understanding of their nocturnal harassers. The first document was a flight roster dated October 10th, listing pilot-navigator pairs for the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Weber noted the names: Yevdokia Bershinskaya, Nadezhda Popova, Yevgenia Zhigulenko, Irina Sabrova. All unmistakably feminine. His initial assumption: clerical error or perhaps Soviet propaganda listing honorary female commanders. The second document contradicted this interpretation. Personnel records showed birth dates, physical descriptions, service histories. Ages ranged from 18 to 23. Flight training certifications from civilian aviation clubs. Awards citations mentioning pilot-navigator with feminine grammatical markers in Russian text. Weber's German translator confirmed these were not clerical errors. The third document eliminated all doubt. Mission logs covering June through September 1942, showing the same names across hundreds of combat sorties. Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova's name appeared 217 times. Weber cross-referenced these logs with German damage reports from the same period. The correlation was undeniable. These women were not instructors, not ferry pilots, not propaganda fabrications. They were conducting the raids that had cost Wehrmacht forces millions in materiel and thousands of casualties. Weber marked his report urgent, requires immediate verification, and sent it up the chain of command, knowing he was about to shatter fundamental assumptions. The report reached Battalion Commander Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller within hours. Müller's initial response mirrored Weber's. He dismissed it as Soviet disinformation, clever psychological warfare designed to humiliate German forces. He filed the report with minimal action. Then similar confirmations arrived the same week from 3 different sectors along the southern front. A downed Po-2 near Armavir yielded the body of a female pilot. Documents confirming her identity as Lieutenant Tatiana Makarova, 203 missions recorded in her logbook. Another airfield capture near Krasnodar produced identical personnel rosters. Pattern recognition became impossible to ignore. Müller escalated the report to division headquarters, then Corps, then Army Group. At each command level, the response followed identical progression: initial disbelief, demand for verification, grudging acceptance when evidence accumulated beyond reasonable doubt. Wehrmacht intelligence conducted comprehensive analysis, confirming the 588th Night Bomber Regiment's existence as all-female unit operational since May 1942. On November 8, 1942, General Lieutenant Werner Kempf presented findings to senior Luftwaffe officers at Army Group A headquarters. The briefing room contained 23 officers, several Knight's Cross recipients among them, men who had fought since Poland in 1939. Kempf displayed captured documents, intelligence photographs showing women in flight gear boarding PO-2 aircraft. Prisoner testimonies from captured ground crew. He showed aircraft serial numbers appearing in raid reports across 8 months, confirming the same aircraft conducted multiple missions. He overlaid Night Witch raid patterns with Wehrmacht casualty reports, demonstrating systematic targeting of high-value installations. The conclusion was unavoidable and humiliating. Women were responsible for the harassment that had cost the Wehrmacht 50 million Reichsmarks, disrupted supply lines across 300 kilometers of front, and rendered German night fighter superiority irrelevant. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that transcended tactical concerns. Many officers refused to accept the findings initially, demanding additional proof despite overwhelming evidence, unable to reconcile operational reality with ideological assumptions about women's capabilities. The humiliation cut deeper than simple military defeat. Elite Luftwaffe pilots had been systematically beaten by women flying agricultural training aircraft designed before Hitler came to power. The propaganda problem was immediate. How could Wehrmacht explain this to German public and frontline troops without destroying morale and validating Soviet claims about fascist incompetence? The ideological conflict proved even more profound. Nazi doctrine explicitly defined women's roles as mothers and homemakers, excluded from combat roles by nature of their supposed physical and mental unsuitability for warfare. Yet operational reality demonstrated women conducting 800 to 1,000 combat missions individually, achieving effectiveness ratios exceeding German male pilots. If women could do this, what else were Germans fundamentally wrong about? Specific reactions varied by rank and personality, but followed predictable patterns. Several Luftwaffe pilots requested transfers to other sectors rather than admit being bested by female opponents. Some officers insisted on referring to them as Soviet night harassment units in official reports, deliberately avoiding any reference to gender. Luftwaffe High Command actively suppressed information distribution, fearing widespread morale impact if frontline troops learned the full truth. Frontline soldiers' reactions differed from officers, grudging respect mixed with fear. The nickname Nachthexen spread rapidly among troops despite official discouragement of the term. Some German units began requesting dedicated anti-Night Witch resources and tactics. Others refused to acknowledge gender entirely, focusing exclusively on tactical threat. On November 22, 1942, Luftwaffe Command issued Operational Order 4427, attempting to contain the psychological damage. All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. Commanders found in violation subject to disciplinary review. While German command struggled with the revelation, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause. On October 17, 1942, the exact day Weber discovered documents at Maikop, she was flying her 309th mission, unaware Germans had just learned her identity and gender. She never knew about the discovery until months later, and when informed, her response was characteristically pragmatic. The information changed nothing about her duties. By the time German intelligence confirmed the 588th Regiment's composition in November 1942, Popova had already completed 347 of her eventual 852 missions, approaching halfway through a career that would make her one of the most prolific combat pilots in military history. On November 10, 1942, 2 days after Kempf's briefing to Army Group A, Popova targeted a German supply depot near Kushchevskaya, destroying 4 supply trucks and an ammunition storage facility. The raid killed 11 German soldiers and wounded 23 more. Her mission report made no mention of German discovery. German casualty reports made no mention of gender. The discovery changed nothing operationally. The Night Witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. "We didn't fly to prove women could fight," Popova later explained. "We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs." After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners during systematic debriefings conducted between 1945 and 1947. Interrogators asked about Eastern Front experiences, specifically about night operations and Soviet tactical innovations. When asked about Night Witches, They encountered unexpected consistency in responses across hundreds of interviews. Even hardened Waffen-SS officers showed visible reaction to the topic, a phenomenon interrogators noted in official reports. Pattern emerged across testimonies, mixture of frustration, respect, and lingering disbelief that characterized German experience with these opponents. Oberleutnant Franz Stadler, Ju-88 night fighter pilot with Nachtjagdgeschwader 4, captured near Berlin in April 1945, provided representative testimony. We received orders to intercept these aircraft in autumn 1942. Command didn't tell us they were women. We only learned after the war ended when interrogators informed us. I attempted interception 17 times between October 1942 and March 1943. 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for engagement. My stall warnings would activate every time I tried to match their speed. It was humiliating beyond description. You train for years to master the Ju-88. You face British Lancaster bombers successfully. You understand air combat doctrine and physics. Then a wooden biplane makes you look foolish night after night. When I learned after surrender they were women, I had no words. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't let us. Gender was irrelevant to that reality. They had beaten the laws of aerodynamics itself, or rather, they had used those laws against us in ways our doctrine never anticipated. Hauptmann Ernst Hoffmann, anti-aircraft battery commander stationed in eastern Ukraine from 1942 to 1944, provided complementary perspective. My battery fired an estimated 38,000 rounds at these aircraft between June 1942 and August 1944. We achieved perhaps 4 or 5 confirmed hits across 2 years, though even those hits rarely resulted in aircraft destruction. They would approach with engines loud, we would prepare weapons and searchlights, then silence. Complete silence. We would fire at where acoustic equipment told us they should be, but we were shooting at ghosts that weren't where we calculated. The sound would return only after bombs exploded and aircraft departed. Psychological effect on my men was severe beyond normal combat stress. We feared the silence more than the bombs, because silence meant they were directly overhead, and we were helpless. Learning after capture, they were women only added to the sense that we had fundamentally underestimated everything about this enemy, not their gender specifically, but our assumption that technological superiority guaranteed victory. It did not. Common themes emerged across testimonies without requiring explicit repetition. Nearly every German interrogated about night witches mentioned silence and its psychological impact. Repeated descriptions of failed interceptions due to speed differential appeared in testimony after testimony, pilots describing identical frustrations with aircraft that flew below minimum engagement speed. Almost universal shock upon learning gender, though reactions varied from those who attempted to rationalize it as Soviet propaganda exaggerating female involvement, to others who admitted gender made no tactical difference and effectiveness remained regardless. Many testimonies included variations on the phrase, "We couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed." Several Germans mentioned specific night witches by reputation or aircraft markings, describing certain POWs they had learned to recognize through distinctive repair patterns or flying styles. Most significantly, many testimonies included explicit acknowledgement that propaganda about Soviet technological and tactical inferiority had been systematically wrong, that German confidence had been misplaced, and that the Eastern Front had taught them respect for Soviet innovation born from necessity. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name at the time. Lieutenant Gustav Richter, infantry officer with the 73rd Infantry Division, captured near Königsberg in January 1945, provided remarkably detailed account. There was one aircraft we learned to recognize by late 1943. It had distinctive pattern of repair patches on the upper wing, looked like patchwork quilt in moonlight. This aircraft appeared over our positions minimum twice weekly. We began calling it the persistent ghost, because it would arrive in silence regardless of our defensive preparations. I personally witnessed this aircraft's attacks 11 times. On July 3, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot. Explosion killed 7 men. On August 14th, it hit our command post, killing our battalion commander and 3 staff officers. On October 2nd, it destroyed a fuel truck convoy. After the war, I requested information from Soviet records about aircraft with that marking pattern. I learned it was likely Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova's aircraft. Soviet records showed she had flown over 852 missions. 852. That number still seems impossible. We never came close to shooting her down despite firing thousands of rounds at her aircraft specifically. She was untouchable, not because of luck, but because of tactics that made her untouchable by design. Popova learned about prisoner interrogations, mentioning her name only during post-war years, when Soviet authorities began compiling combat histories. Her response combined satisfaction with pragmatism. She had flown her 852nd and final mission in May 1945, days before German surrender, maintaining operational tempo until the war's absolute conclusion. The 852 missions, including the nights when she flew multiple sorties that tested human endurance limits, became documented not just in Soviet military records, but in German testimonies that confirmed what their forces had discovered too late to matter tactically. Her post-war reflection, when asked about German prisoners describing their inability to stop her, was characteristically direct. We did what needed doing. Whether they respected us or feared us or were humiliated by us was their concern, not ours. Our concern was victory, and we achieved it. That they struggled to accept being beaten by women reflected their weakness, not our strength. We were simply pilots doing our duty. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The night witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front. And Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 3 years earlier. 852 combat missions. The number seemed fictional even to Soviet high command, requiring verification against multiple independent sources before official acceptance. Over 3 years of continuous operations from May 1942 through May 1945, she had flown an average of 28 missions monthly, never missing more than 3 consecutive nights, except when grounded by catastrophic weather that prevented all flight operations. Total flight hours exceeded 1,700, calculated from average mission duration of 2 hours, including transit, bombing run, and return. Total ordnance delivered approached 170 tons of high-explosive bombs dropped with precision on German positions, supply lines, and installations. She survived the entire war without being shot down, though her aircraft absorbed damage on dozens of occasions, most notably the 42 bullet holes sustained during her 497th mission. Soviet recognition came swiftly. Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor, alongside Order of the Red Banner, Order of the Red Star, and multiple campaign medals. The physical toll was severe and permanent. Frostbite had scarred her hands and face from 3 winters flying in open cockpits at -40 degrees. Hearing damage from 1,700 hours of engine noise directly behind her head would affect her for life. The psychological resilience required to climb into that cockpit 852 times, knowing each mission could end with ground fire shredding canvas and flesh, exceeded calculation. 32 of her comrades died during the regiment's operations. Their deaths reminders that survival was never guaranteed regardless of skill or experience. To understand the magnitude of these numbers, context matters fundamentally. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40 to 60 missions during their careers before rotation, loss, or war's end. United States Army Air Force rotated bomber crews home after completing 25 missions, considered full combat tour requiring rest and recovery. Popova's 852 missions represented the equivalent of 34 complete American tours of duty, without rotation or rest, beyond what operational tempo allowed. Average Soviet male bomber pilots accumulated 150 to 300 missions during the war, already considered exceptional service. Other night witches averaged 500 to 600 missions, itself remarkable. Popova exceeded even this extraordinary standard by 40%. Her 852 missions represented more combat sorties than entire bomber groups combined. At 2 hours per mission, she accumulated flight time exceeding most commercial airline pilots' annual totals, except her flights involved people actively trying to kill her. At 200 kilograms bombs per mission average, She delivered 170 tons of explosives onto German positions. Conservative estimates placed German casualties directly attributable to her missions at over 400 killed or wounded, with material destruction valued at 18 million Reichsmarks. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to field all-female combat unit flying obsolete aircraft. Over 3 years of continuous operations, the regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties, averaging 20 missions nightly when weather permitted. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions, significantly disrupting Wehrmacht operations across southern sectors. Estimated German casualties inflicted by the regiment exceeded 5,000 killed or wounded, though exact numbers remained impossible to verify given the chaotic nature of their raids and German record-keeping failures in retreat. Material destroyed included hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, dozens of artillery positions, and countless installations ranging from supply depots to command posts. Regiment casualties totaled 32 killed from approximately 80 personnel deployed over the war, yielding 96.8% survival rate. Compare this to conventional Soviet bomber units suffering 40 to 60% attrition rates. Cost-effectiveness analysis revealed the strategic brilliance. The regiment cost approximately $2 million to create and sustain, while inflicting damage valued at $50 million minimum. German expenditure attempting to counter them reached 125 million Reichsmarks, creating cost ratio of 1 to 60. For every ruble Soviets invested, Germans spent 60 attempting to stop operations that continued regardless. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of night witches throughout the war. Almost all regiment losses resulted from ground fire, not air combat, validating their tactics completely. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value the night witches provided. Psychological warfare impact exceeded physical damage in many respects. German troops suffered degraded morale and chronic sleep deprivation, reducing combat effectiveness measurably. Medical records from German units showed increased stress-related casualties in sectors facing regular night witch operations. 5,000 German soldiers were tied down in air defense roles, specifically countering night harassment, removing them from offensive operations where manpower shortages increasingly crippled Wehrmacht capability. Supply lines required longer, more vulnerable routes to avoid known night witch operating areas, adding logistics burden Germany could not afford. Propaganda value proved immense. Soviet citizens saw proof that women could fight effectively, boosting morale throughout the nation. German miscalculations were exposed systematically, revealing flaws in intelligence assessment and tactical doctrine that undermined confidence in military leadership. The regiment provided textbook example of asymmetric warfare, demonstrating how irregular tactics could neutralize conventional superiority. Marshal Georgy Zhukov noted in his memoirs, "The night witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them. In war, this equation represents victory. The 588th Regiment proved that technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and determination can overcome engineering advantages." Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle absolutely. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced a different kind of challenge, returning to life without nightly combat. Initial recognition came swiftly with Hero of the Soviet Union ceremony, parades through Moscow, speeches to factory workers and military academies. But transitioning from 3 years of nightly missions to civilian existence proved difficult. She had spent her early 20s in constant combat. Peacetime felt alien initially. She continued in aviation, becoming flight instructor and later civil aviation pilot, unable to abandon flying despite its associations with war. She married fellow pilot and started family, finding stability gradually. Speaking about her experiences proved complicated. Stalin's government promoted certain war heroes while suppressing others based on political calculations. Recognition fluctuated with Soviet political climate. During some periods, her story was celebrated, During others, authorities discouraged discussion of individual heroism that might overshadow party narrative. She maintained relationships with surviving squadron mates, annual reunions marking their shared experience that civilians could never fully understand. She advocated quietly for women's continued presence in military aviation, though Soviet forces largely relegated women to non-combat roles post-war. She died in 2013 at age 91, having lived long enough to see her story finally receive recognition it deserved. Her hometown erected monument. Russian Air Force Museum features extensive exhibit on the Night Witches with her uniform and medals prominently displayed. For decades, the Night Witches remained virtually unknown in the West. Cold War politics meant Soviet military achievements were dismissed as propaganda or ignored entirely. Western historians had limited access to Soviet archives. German testimonies existed but weren't widely published. During the 1980s and 1990s, Glasnost and subsequent Soviet collapse allowed stories to emerge. Historians gained access to previously classified records. German POW testimonies were cross-referenced with Soviet documents, validating accounts that seemed too extraordinary to believe. By the 2000s and 2010s, books and documentaries brought Night Witch's story to Western audiences. German testimonies proved particularly valuable, confirming Soviet accounts couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration. Western recognition grew that this wasn't propaganda, but meticulously documented history. Museums began featuring their story beyond Russia. Monuments and memorials appeared. Schools and streets were named after regiment members. Films depicted their operations, though with varying historical accuracy. Nadezhda Popova specifically was honored with multiple biographies and documentary features. Her story became synonymous with Night Witch's legacy, her 852 missions representing the regiment's sustained effectiveness. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment, offering lessons applicable beyond World War II's Eastern Front. About warfare, asymmetric tactics can defeat technological superiority when properly applied. Psychological impact sometimes exceeds physical damage in military effectiveness. Innovation matters more than resources when constraints force creative solutions. Underestimating any enemy based on preconceptions is a fatal mistake that no amount of technological advantage can compensate for. About underestimation specifically, German assumptions about gender and aircraft primitiveness blinded them to actual threat until damage was irreversible. Prejudice creates tactical vulnerabilities that determined opponents will exploit. Your enemy's apparent weakness may be their greatest strength when they understand operational environment better than you do. Never dismiss threats based on assumptions rather than evidence. About determination, flying 852 missions required extraordinary physical and psychological resilience. Each mission could be last, yet she climbed into that cockpit repeatedly for 3 years. The toll was immense: frostbite, hearing damage, witnessing comrades die. Yet she continued. Survival required skill, luck, and absolute refusal to quit regardless of odds. About physics and engineering, sometimes simple design beats complex when operational requirements favor simplicity. Understanding your environment matters more than raw specifications. The stall speed paradox proved this definitively. Constraints force innovation that abundance never requires. The right tool for any job isn't always the most advanced tool, but rather the tool that matches operational reality. When Oberst Friedrich Hartmann stood before his pilots in February 1943 and laughed at women flying crop dusters, he couldn't imagine that within months those same women would systematically dismantle his supply infrastructure, that Nadezhda Popova would fly 852 times over positions he defended, that the wooden biplanes he dismissed would prove untouchable by his finest fighters. He calculated speed, firepower, technology, but never calculated determination. German engineers perfected doctrine based on physics and metallurgy. Assuming superiority was mathematical certainty, they were wrong. Popova and her sisters proved that courage doesn't require the best equipment, that skill can overcome raw power, and that tactical innovation makes specifications irrelevant. Her 852 missions weren't just numbers in Soviet records. They were proof that Germans had calculated everything except the variable that mattered most: the will to fight, in wooden biplanes that shouldn't have worked, against an enemy that refused to take them seriously until too late. The Night Witches demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy never sees coming until it's already overhead in silence, dropping bombs while their searchlights sweep empty sky, looking for threats their doctrine told them couldn't exist.